Welcome to Decoding Healthcare Research. I'm your host, Efrain Riveros, Dr. E.F. Rain. Today, we are going to tackle a topic that has been controversial, and is the effects of a plant-based diet, and in contradistinction to a meat-based diet. When we started exploring the effect of different diets, we understood that all the diets belong to a spectrum. And on one end, you have the standard American diet, and on the other end, you have probably the ketogenic diet and the paleo diet. And there are some diets in between. The Mediterranean diet is kind of in the middle, is balanced. But if you move more towards the vegetable side of the equation, you go into the vegan diet and the vegetarian diet. And all of these have been approached from the micro and macronutrient standpoint. Well, today we are going to explore different aspects specifically related to carnivore diet, and we are going to shed light on some facts regarding the nutritional value and the risks that you may basically take when you base your diet only on animal products. And to discuss this important topic, we have the honor of having with us Dr. Rami Najjar. He is a researcher of the Institute for Biomedical Sciences at Georgia State University in Georgia, United States. Welcome, Dr. Najjar.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you. So as I mentioned at the beginning, people are very concerned about what to eat and what not to eat. And there was a great enthusiasm in the past regarding a pure plant-based diet. And still there are many people that are advocates for this type of approach. But at the same time, especially in the last decade, there is also enthusiasm towards the meat-based diets. So my first question to you is, where can you find a balance, if there is one? Or better put yet, what do you think are the main advantages of basing your nutrition on a plant-based diet?
So you mentioned how, animal-based diets are more of a recent phenomenon. I think it's been going on longer than the past 10 years, from the Atkins to paleo to keto to carnivore. It keeps emerging, these types of low carbohydrate approaches in which animal products seem to be maximized. It's very difficult to if you look at the research and literature as a whole, you have to ignore a large body of evidence to consider these diets health promoting. It requires a lot of cherry picking and looking at studies perhaps with a less than critical eye to conclude that these diets are indeed cardiovascular disease preventing or can promote longevity. Even in the United States, the American Heart Association, for example, in the recent dietary recommendations, their guidelines for promoting cardiometabolic health, they ranked paleo diets, Atkins, and keto diets as one of the worst diets in preventing cardiovascular disease. In other words, they likely promote cardiovascular disease. And you mentioned the Mediterranean diet earlier. I believe most of the health components of the Mediterranean diet are from the plants. The DASH diet was based on a more plant-based Mediterranean diet type approach. In terms of the health promoting factors of a plant-based diet, of course, the basic micro and macronutrients, fiber, potassium, etc. But beyond that, which is what my research focuses on, I look at the polyphenol contents, the phytochemical contents of these diets. And these phytochemicals, as the name implies, phyto being plant, are exclusively found in plant foods. And these chemicals have bioactive properties at the cellular level. They can target a variety of enzymes and proteins involved in oxidative stress and inflammation, attenuating these, and can promote longevity and prevent cardiovascular diseases.
Yeah, you are completely right. So when we, I think that the plant-based diet has been shown over and over again that has benefits on the cardiovascular risk profile, and I think there's no doubt about it. And before we tackle what happens actually with the carnivore diet and ketogenic diet, I want to focus about the beneficial effects of the plant-based diet. And I want to start only from the macronutrient standpoint. So the fact that you are receiving carbohydrates, mostly complex carbohydrates, a lot of fiber, and the like healthy combination of macronutrients is something that stands out when you talk about a plant-based diet. So macronutrient standpoint, what do you think are the main benefits of a plant-based diet?
Yes, certainly. So you mentioned the fiber and carbohydrates. When people hear carbohydrates, they conflate it with refined grains, sugars, etc. When we talk about a healthy plant-based high carbohydrate diet, we're talking about sweet potatoes, beans, whole grains. To look at carbohydrate content alone, I believe I mentioned in the article, I can make a comparison between Frosted Flakes and sugary cereal and candy, for example, being very high in carbohydrates, but so are fruits and beans and sweet potatoes. As you mentioned, it's the complex carbohydrates, the fact that they're unrefined, have intact polyphenol content, being very rich in fiber. Fiber is in a dose-dependent manner tied to reduced cardiovascular mortality, increased lifespan. I think fiber is one of the most beneficial macronutrients that can be consumed. 97% of people in the United States do not consume enough fiber. It's the nutrient that's most lacking in the diet.
That's great. And as we move from macronutrients to other aspects that are important in the diet, the effect on the microbiome is something that we cannot forget. And also, you mentioned the polyphenols. So we can use the polyphenols as a segue to understand that there is effect of what you eat on your inflammatory profile. Am I right?
Yes, definitely. And these effects happen in the postprandial phase immediately after a meal within the first 6 hours.
Wow, that's surprising. Now, if we talk about carnivore diet, and there are some papers trying to advocate for carnivore diets and the likes of that. One of the aspects that is controversial is the effect on the lipid profile, right? Specifically, when we talk about ketogenic diet, some studies have shown that the LDL goes up. And when you compare that with the studies about plant-based diets, it goes in the opposite direction. So the lipid profile is definitely better preserved with plant-based diet. So what is your opinion about the argument that even though the LDL cholesterol can go up with ketogenic diet, it may have to do more with the larger size type of molecule, and that in a certain way is not as damaging to the cardiovascular system. What do you think about that argument?
So I mentioned earlier how to advocate for a ketogenic diet, you really have to ignore a lot. And this is one of those examples. I've heard this argument before regarding the smaller, dense LDL versus the larger, quote unquote, fluffier LDL. It's important to note that both of these are associated with increased cardiovascular risk. It's not that the larger one is absent in risk, it still is increased with cardiovascular risk. And the American Heart Association presidential panel had a recent guideline statement essentially stating that based on every line of evidence that the link between LDL and cardiovascular disease is essentially causal, and this was reached independently by 3 independent review panels based on a wide breadth of knowledge, randomized studies, Mendelian randomization, and epidemiological studies. It's essentially a causal relationship, and you like to hear arguments from different bloggers and other individuals that LDL, cholesterol, and heart disease is not causal. It's an association. It's actually much more than that. It is indeed, it reaches the level of causality.
Yeah, and it's clear that the plant-based diets help control better the lipid profile and reduce cardiovascular risk. And this has to do not only with the intake of the cholesterol itself, but also with the ability that you have to modulate inflammatory processes and oxidation of the LDL molecule. So how do you think, or where exactly is the difference between a meat-based diet and the plant-based diet when it comes to oxidation of LDL?
Yes. So LDL, it's when you eat dietary cholesterol, that's a small contributing factor, but also saturated fat, which is found mostly in animal foods, can increase LDL. And there's certain things that can help with cholesterol secretion that allows your gut to remove excess cholesterol, and that can reduce LDL. In terms of the specific question regarding oxidation, so animal foods, because they contain cholesterol in themselves, these can actually become oxidized based on simply cooking, and under storage conditions, these can become oxidized. And we know based on human studies that once you consume oxidized cholesterol, this is assimilated into your native cholesterol. So you can directly track it. Oxidized cholesterol from food moving into your body and circulating into your bloodstream. And this can certainly increase oxidative stress and inflammation. It can bind to, it's known to be a ligand for toll-like receptor 4, which it drives inflammation in every single cardiovascular cell type. Oxidized LDL in animal models can exacerbate cardiovascular atherosclerosis, heart failure, and oxidized cholesterol is the #1 predictor of cardiovascular disease incidence compared to even regular LDL cholesterol. So it can come from our food.
Yeah,
go. I was going to say,
I'm sorry. No, I was going to say that we could say that the oxidation of LDL starts with the LDL, with the cholesterol intake, rather, in addition to the endogenous production of oxidized LDL, right? So it comes from both sources?
So essentially, the endogenous production can become oxidized. If there's an increased oxidative stress state, this can oxidize endogenously produced LDL. And if you have a higher concentration of cholesterol, there's more LDL available to become oxidized. So if you take people with normal cholesterol levels, borderline high, but still relatively normal at borderline, and versus high, you can see a stepwise increase in oxidized LDL concentration. And these people, even with borderline elevated LDL, have impaired endothelial function compared to normal lipidemic subjects. So it seems to be this oxidized LDL that's driving it. So it can come from diet. It can be oxidized in your own body, and when it's elevated, there's increased availability for LDL to become oxidized as well.
So we can say then that when it comes to dietary cholesterol, rather than the amount of cholesterol that certain type of food may have, the degree of oxidation in that cholesterol becomes an important variable as well, right?
Certainly, yes. Yeah. It's
Yeah,
almost
that's
expected
interesting.
that if you have high cholesterol, you will certainly have high oxidized cholesterol as well. They mirror
I
each other.
see.
Yes.
I see. One of the difficulties that I have found that difficulty myself, actually, to go to the papers. Sometimes it's difficult to isolate like the pure form of a diet when you compare it with a different type of diet. What I'm trying to say is that, and that happens with both carnivore diet and plant-based diet studies. Sometimes you are comparing apples to oranges, because sometimes when you talk about plant-based diet, sometimes is not the pure form of it, and some of the subjects are allowed to have sugars in a different, even though they are like simple carbohydrates. The mere fact that it's not animal food is considered okay, and then the results are obscured, but that lack of being strict, if that makes sense. And that also happens with the carnivore diet studies. Sometimes uh, processed meats are allowed to be part of that carnivore diet. So then it's difficult to dissect and to know exactly what can be attributed to the animal product itself and what can be attributed to the processing of that food. So in that regard, do you think that this is a variable that is important when you interpret the studies?
I think it's definitely an important variable for interpreting these clinical findings. And you bring up a good point, because when you look at a lot of the low carb literature versus, they say low fat is inferior to high fat or high protein. There's better benefits, better cholesterol reduction, etc. And then you look at the low fat group, and they're getting less than 15 grams of fiber a day. It's highly processed. It's not an accurate comparison. And in the same token, you'll also get these. For example, there was a recent nutrients paper published in Nutrients, a review article looking at the benefits of keto in cardiovascular disease prevention, and almost every single study they looked at was designed to be hypocaloric, in that calories were required to be reduced, 1,800 calories, 1,500 calories a day. So of course they reduced blood lipids, hypertension, they reduced body weight. You can't make these comparisons if you tell them eat less food and then but have it be keto and then you get benefit. It doesn't make sense. When you look at the studies that match calories, for example, NIH has done some interesting work when they did a calorie matched low fat diet and calorie matched low carb diet, and what they found was the low carbohydrate diet, while there was more weight loss, it was not necessarily more fat loss. The low fat diet actually had more fat burning. You burned more fat compared to the low carbohydrate diet. And then they also did isocaloric high carbohydrate diet versus keto diet. And they found that the keto diet increased inflammation, increased free fatty acids. They were insulin resistant after giving them a carbohydrate challenge. So when you look at more calorie matched diets, not designed to reduce body weight, and you consider the factors of having both diets healthy by their own respective standards, that's the best way to interpret these findings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we think about vegan diets, it's a little bit easier to find good quality studies because subjects can be more strict. And I think it's very clear that the evidence is in favor of this type of diet when it comes to lipid profiles and cardiovascular risk. And that is something that we need to advise people to, even if they are not completely vegan, I would say, to get all the carbohydrates from natural sources, like plant-based, right? That would be probably a good recommendation. But regarding meat itself, there are certain nutrients, if you will, or molecules that are not found in sufficient amounts in plants. Obviously, you can supplement things like vitamin B12, but what about carnitine, for instance, or taurine, or even choline? Do you think that a lack of nutrients in these particular examples affect the ability to have a well-balanced diet when you only eat vegetables?
Yeah, carnitine is not something you really need to be worrying about. There's plenty of endogenous production that's found in certain foods, but endogenously you produce plenty of it. Choline is more lacking, but beans and whole grains have appreciable quantities of choline. But it seems that the gut microbiota, if you eat a more meat-based diet, can actually convert choline and carnitine into harmful byproducts, trimethylamine oxide, TMAO, which is very tightly linked to not only atherosclerosis, coronary artery disease, but also heart failure. And this is in both human, animal, and in vitro studies. It's very clear that TMAO is very tightly linked to cardiovascular disease. And you can only get TMAO production if you eat an animal-based diet. You can give somebody who consumes a vegan diet a carnitine challenge, and they won't produce any TMAO, but omnivorous subjects will. And this has been repeated in the literature in clinical studies.
Yeah, you have mentioned the 2 or 3 important aspects that I want to highlight here. One is the role of the microbiota and how it is negatively affected by intake of significant amounts of meat. And the other one has to do with the mechanisms to trigger the inflammatory process and to trigger the production of free radical species of oxygen. Can you tell us a little bit more about what happens or what are the proposed mechanisms by which a meat-based diet results in increased cardiovascular risk?
Yes. So in my view, one of the central receptors that's found in every cell that is involved in this process is the toll-like receptor, specifically TLR4. Normally, it's involved in innate immunity if there's any bacterial components, specifically the outer cytoskeleton of bacteria contains lipopolysaccharides. This can bind to TLRs. There are a variety of other ligands that can bind to TLR4. But when you eat animal-based foods, the animal-based foods contain appreciable quantities of these lipopolysaccharides, and these can translocate from the gut into the body at small concentrations, but that can be detected and that are relevant in inducing an inflammatory response. Postprandial studies have shown that if you eat a meal containing animal-based meal, or just cream, which contains substantial LPS lipopolysaccharides, you'll get a stepwise increase in oxidative stress, inflammation, and this parallels blood LPS concentrations in a very and they parallel each other. So yeah, and TLR4 is central to this. So TLR4 downstream in the cell activates an inflammatory response. It also causes oxidative stress, increased superoxide production, hydrogen peroxide production as well.
Yeah, and it's fascinating to see how, and you explore it in your paper, something that initially affects the immune system with the TLR receptor that you just mentioned has its counterpart in the cardiovascular system. So the myocytes themselves and the endothelial cells are part of this cascade of pro-inflammatory and pro-oxidative stress, right?
Yes, every single cell of the cardiovascular system has TLR4, and there's definitely an interpore activated on the endothelial cells, which are the cells lining the inner every single blood vessel from the blood. They're the inner wall of the blood vessel, essentially, in contact with the blood. TLR4 activation can increase they release glycoproteins, which allow macrophages or monocytes to attach to, and macrophages and monocytes which have TLR4 activation are more prone to translocate into the subendothelial space, the space just below endothelial cells, and they become inflammatory, consume oxidized cholesterol, and this can result in cardiovascular disease. And also the heart, cardiomyocytes, when TLR4 is active, increased inflammation, same process with the immune system. Hypertrophy can occur over time. Over many decades of this constant low-grade insult with activation of TLR4, LPS in the blood, oxidized LDL, because oxidized LDL can also activate TLR4. Over many, many decades and years, cardiovascular disease develops, and this is how it happens, and mostly in the postprandial phase, right after a meal.
And you mentioned the cardiac remodeling, and that brings to my memory. I practiced critical care for some time in my career, and I remember that we were very concerned about the importance of the renin-angiotensin axis on remodeling of the heart. And it was news to me when I went over your paper that this axis is actually affected by what you eat, right?
Yes. High intakes of saturated fats, which the carnivore diets and ketogenic diets promote the copious consumption of, and particularly palmitate, can increase the renin-angiotensin system. And you can actually infuse subjects with these free fatty acids, the same types you'd find in people who eat a high-fat diet. And you'll actually get a spike in the renin-angiotensin system. It's upregulated, increased ACE1, increased angiotensin 2. And this is directly tied to endothelial dysfunction. And when you give these people who've been infused these lipids, AT1R agonists, losartan, or ACE inhibitors, you'll get a blunting of this effect. So
Yeah,
these, yeah.
Another thing that I want to discuss is for some people, going full vegan can be a little bit extreme for them, for some individuals, and they want to kind of incorporate some animal products, in particular fish. It's common for people to say, okay, I'm going to give up red meats and I will stay with fish. And the fish actually has had good reputation, perhaps because of its association with the Mediterranean diet. So what is your opinion about having that combination of plant-based food, incorporating some fish here and there?
Yeah, of all the animal foods, I think that fish is the least problematic. I will say that based on epidemiological data, when you look at pescatarians versus full vegans, for example, Adventist Health Study, you'll see that the vegans do have an advantage. They're lower body weight, less diabetes risk, less cardiovascular risk. So there seems to be a benefit to excluding it if you're replacing it with whole plant foods. But in terms of looking at between animal products, fish is definitely healthier compared to others.
I see. I think that pretty much summarizes everything in terms of the benefits of a plant-based diet. But I would like to ask you, what would be your recommendation for someone who already has risk factors for cardiovascular disease? What would be your dietary recommendation for that person?
So it's never too early to begin consuming a plant-based diet. We cardiovascular disease develops in infancy. Mothers who have a poor diet, their fetuses, when they do biopsies, in these cases, they find that there's already fatty plaques, but this can be reversed. The plant-based diet, in fact, is the only diet that I could identify in the literature that is able to actually reverse cardiovascular disease, not just atherosclerosis by shrinking plaques, but also in heart failure, improving ejection fraction, uh, getting people off of medications. We have some preliminary data, a clinical case series in 7 subjects, which is we're about to submit it. But essentially, these patients all had acute heart failure, and they had failed guideline-directed medical therapies. We were able to reduce medications substantially in these patients, and all of them had improved ejection fraction, no longer had chest pain, could exercise. They had much more energy. Their life was completely changed. So I would, in terms of your specific question, what recommendations? The more whole plant foods you consume, the better. The less meat you consume, the better. So the more it's definitely a stepwise. The more you have, the better off you'll be.
Yeah, that's good advice for those who are struggling with controlling their cardiovascular risk, because it's clear that plant-based diets affect directly in a positive way the lipid profile and all the cardiovascular risks. And regarding what you just said, I read some reports from the Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Esselstyn, demonstrating basically that the changes in the coronary arteries, the atheroma formation regressed, and the perfusion on the heart cath was significantly improved. that is just in regards to coronary artery disease. But what you are saying is that in heart failure from other origins, it also works, right?
Yes, correct. Yes, this is it's been there's only been case reports and case series. There needs to be a formal study looking at this, but based on the evidence, it seems pretty profound that a plant-based diet can have this effect. But this has to be some randomized clinical trials have to be conducted, but preliminary data is very promising.
Yeah, that's true. Unfortunately, sometimes it's difficult some people see these nutritional interventions as deviation from standard of care, and that makes it difficult to make the comparisons on large clinical trials. But I am sure that with time, we are going to be able to overcome this obstacle. And I think this conversation has been really fruitful, and I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge with us, and definitely for highlighting the importance of a good balanced nutrition and the benefits of the plant-based diet. I appreciate you spending this time with me today.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you so much. For our audience, we are going to have some information about Dr. Najjar and his work. And don't forget to leave us your feedback, and see you in the next episode.